All right, so the next segment of this is talking about intervals of increase and decrease, and so basically this is the way that we look at the graph. Our number one thing that we need to make a note of here is that when we think about intervals of increase and decrease is that when we talk about them, we use x values. So, like for example, when I come across on this graph right here, I have a low point right there. The only variable that I care about in that low point is the x variable. So like I'm not even going to think about that guy right there. I'm only going to focus on that number. When I look at this spot right here, which is another high point on this graph, that's my x value. So I don't care about the y value. So I'm only going to focus on the x value. Now from that, when I talk about my intervals of increase and decrease, what I like to do is to kind of provide myself with like I don't know, like an imaginary line, let's say. So I had this imaginary line right here and right here. And the reason that those two lines are right there is because those are spots where my graph changes. Those are the graphs where they change their characteristic, their behavior. So for example, this first interval right here, this would be an interval of decrease. Because as I move across this graph, as I go from negative infinity across this graph is coming down. It's decreasing, it's decreasing, it's decreasing. As I turn the corner at that low point, the spot right here, which would be called a turning point, that would be called a turning point. In this case, that turning point is minimum. I turn the corner and now my graph becomes an increasing function. So my graph is increasing, increasing, increasing until I get to this spot right here, which once again is considered another turning point. It's not necessarily a maximum because my graph doesn't go any higher than, or any lower than that. It just stops right there. But then the next interval is what we call a constant interval because my graph doesn't change. It doesn't increase, it doesn't decrease, it's just constant. So now our job is to come in here and to identify the interval in which we're talking about. Well, remember, we're only going to discuss in terms of x. So this first interval, we're cruising along right here. So we come in from negative infinity. As we're coming from negative infinity, our graph's coming down, 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 down. So from negative infinity to negative 2. So from negative infinity to negative 2, this interval right here, my graph is decreasing. So negative infinity all the way to negative 2. At negative 2, I'm actually at a low point. I'm at a turning point or a minimum. So my increasing interval occurs from negative 2 and goes to positive 4. And that's going to be this interval right here. So this would be all of this. Remember, I'm describing it in terms of the x values. So in terms of the x values, I go from negative 2 to positive 4. Those x's will make my function increase. Last but not least, from positive 4 to infinity, so from positive 4 on out forevers and evers, I'm in an interval of constant, or a constant interval. And so by creating these three different intervals, maybe with these imaginary dotted lines, what I'm doing is I'm kind of allowing myself to see this separation of the different parts of the graph. So my intervals of increase and decrease will be listed as so. On the next guy, we do the same thing. We key in on the key important points. So in this case right here, this would be called a turning point. In this case, this turning point would be a maximum. This down here, this spot right here would be a turning point. I'm going to call it a TP, and it would be a minimum. Remember, once again, we only care about the x value, so I cross off the y value so I don't even think about them. And then I create like these vertical lines that kind of create this separation, or they create our zones. And then we ask ourselves, if you need to, use a highlighter so you can kind of see it. We ask ourselves and we say, okay, well, my graph is doing something in the green area. In the blue area, it's doing something. And then in the yellow area, it's doing something different. So each one of these regions has a different increase or decrease. And the first one, this guy right here, would be an interval of increase. So from negative infinity, because I'm coming from negative infinity, on over to negative 3. I'm increasing. At negative 3, all the way to positive 3, so from negative 3 to positive 3, right? Negative 3 is that landmark. Positive 3 is that landmark. I am decreasing. Then I turn the corner, and from positive 3 to infinity, because this is positive infinity out here, I am increasing. So increasing and decreasing variable or intervals, make sure that you use your x values to describe. Now that's really counterintuitive because you're looking at the graph going up and down, which is the y variable, but you're going to tell me in terms of the x variable, which is side to side. So counterintuitive, so be careful, pay attention to that, x values only.